Hello everybody, this is chapter 8 of Stig of the Dump and it's called Midsummer Night. Barney lay awake on his bed. It was hot and he hung his feet over the edge of the bed to cool them down. Somewhere in the room a summer mosquito was whining about, and from outside came the drone of a farm tractor working late and the barking of dogs from the village. Though the curtains were drawn, he knew that it was still daytime outside. It would be daytime for hours yet, but he had to go to bed in the daylight just because he was only 8. Still, he wouldn't go to sleep. He couldn't. It was so hot and stuffy. He had asked his granny about why he couldn't stay up until it was dark, and she had explained that today was the longest day, and tonight was the shortest night, and that it wouldn't get dark until after 10 o'clock. Far too late for a boy of 8 to stay up. All right, he thought. If it was the shortest night, he wouldn't go to sleep at all. He would see what it was like not to go to sleep. Barney thought of Stig. I bet he doesn't go to sleep when it's daylight, he thought. And he's... how old? How old was Stig? About 8? 80? 800? 8,000? Thinking of figures made Barney feel drowsy, and before he knew it, he'd gone off to sleep. It was Granny going to bed that woke him up again. She only opened the door a little to see if he was all right, but suddenly he was wide awake. Bother! He'd been asleep after all, but he wouldn't do it again. He'd stay awake now. He got out of bed and looked out of the window. At first he thought it was still daytime, but no, the light came from a big white moon in the south, and in the north there was still a bluish light, as if the sun had not gone far out of sight behind the elm trees. He wouldn't go back to bed. He'd go out in the moonlight. He'd go and see Stig in the moonlight. His heart was thumping as he thought of the idea. It was still very warm, so he slipped on a pair of shorts and nothing else, and crept carefully out of his bedroom and down the creaking stairs. He pulled at the stiff bolts of the front door, trying to make no noise, but Dinah the spaniel, who slept downstairs, must have heard him, for she gave a questioning bark. "Be quiet, Dinah," whispered Barney crossly. "It's only me. If you don't shut up, you'll spoil everything." At last he managed to undo the stiff bolts and the lock, and the door swung open. He went outside into the shadow of the house, and then into the moonlight. Everything was very still. Suddenly he jumped as he heard his name being called. "Barney!" It was Lou, looking down from her bedroom window. "Barney, what are you doing?" Lou hissed. "Just going out. Nothing to do with you," answered Barney quietly. "But it's the middle of the night." "I know. I don't care, it's light as day." "Golly, so it is," said Lou. "But where are you going, Barney?" "I'm not going to tell you." "Oh, please, Barney, don't go yet. Can I come too?" Lou begged. Barney looked at the dark shadows under the fruit trees and thought of how shadowy the pit would be. Perhaps it would be better with two. All right, you can be my bodyguard. Hurry up then." "Oh, thank you, Barney." Lou's head disappeared from the window, and soon Barney heard the click of her door and the creak of the stairs. When she appeared at the front of the house, she had Dinah with her too. "I thought I'd bring Dinah," she said, "as an extra bodyguard. Where are we going, Barney?" "I'm going to see Stig." Lou gasped. "Really and truly, Barney?" "Of course. You can come with me to the pit, but I'll have to ask him if he wants to see you." "All right, Barney," said Lou, with wide open eyes. They set off together through the moonlit garden. "The red roses look black in the moonlight," said Lou. "Do they?" said Barney. I can see as well in the moonlight as in the daytime. Come on." They went through the gate into the paddock. Flash, the old pony, was awake and cropping the dewy grass. He tossed his head and snorted in surprise when he saw them. Then he went back to his feeding. They crossed the paddock. Dinah running in rings along rabbit trails, and came to the edge of the copse. In spite of the strong moonlight and the faint glow in the north, it looked very dark under the trees. They stood still. "Shh," said Barney. "What is it?" whispered Lou. "Isn't it quiet?" whispered Barney. It was so quiet that they could hear the chiming of a church clock from a long way away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. "Midnight," breathed Lou. They walked to the edge of the dark wood together. Then they stopped. How different the moonlight made everything look. They seemed to be standing on the edge of a deep forest pierced by shadowy glades instead of the straggling copse they knew. Even Dinah, who usually took any excuse to go plunging into thickets after rabbits, seemed to hesitate. Then she sniffed. The hair on the back of her neck rose up, and she barked. Barney felt the hair on the back of his neck rising too. He jumped as the pony came prancing up and snorted behind them, and stood looking with pricked ears in the same direction as Dinah. Dinah barked again. Then, before their eyes, a great animal leapt into a patch of moonlight in the glade and stood there for a moment. "It's a stag," breathed Lou with astonishment. "I know," whispered Barney. "But there aren't any stags here," exclaimed Lou. Dinah was the first to recover from her surprise, and she hurled herself into the glade, with the stag bounded off into the woods with Dinah in pursuit. The pony snorted and blew behind them, and stood there with quivering nostrils. It was then that the children went midsummer crazy. Without a word, Lou grabbed the pony by the mane. Barney legged her up onto the pony's back. Lou hoisted him up in front, and before they could stop to think, they had cleared the fence and were galloping straight for the edge of the pit. The pit was there all right, the pony poised on the edge. Then, with a spring and a scramble, which kept them too busy clinging with legs and hands to think about what was happening, Flash was down and up on the other side. What had happened? Instead of the great quarry, there was a mere scratch in the ground, and now nothing was familiar. They expected every minute to come to the cornfield beyond the copse, but the thickets and glades stretched on and on. They were treading the slope which should have led to the lane, and Flash slowed down a little, but from far ahead came Dinah's mad yelping and the crashing of the undergrowth, and the pony needed no urging to pursue the hunt. And still no landmarks that they knew came into sight. No open fields, no hedges, no orchards, no farms. Only hazel thickets, beechwoods, and the chalky hillside. Without a rein to guide or restrain him, the pony went like the wind, his head up, and Barney and Lou could only cling there with their bare legs and look with round eyes at the strange landscape. "Barney!" gasped Lou, clinging to her brother more tightly than she had ever done before. "We're dreaming all this, really." "You may be, I'm not," Barney shouted against the wind and twined his fingers more deeply into the pony's mane. They were galloping up a little valley between clumps of bramble and taller bushes. There was no sound of barking from Dinah. Suddenly, in the moonlight, was the dog, lying stretched out on the turf right in front of them. The pony slowed and swerved. The children fell off in a tangle of limbs onto the soft grass that smelt of wild thyme, and the pony trotted off casually to get his breath back. Of the stag there was no sign. Barney and Lou sorted themselves out. Lou tried to stand up, but her legs felt woolly after using them to cling on to the horse for so long, and she sat down again. "Well, Dinah," she said to the dog, "where's the stag, eh? Couldn't catch it, I suppose. Never mind. You're not a staghound, are you, eh, Dinah?" Then she turned to Barney. "Barney, if we're not dreaming all this, where are we?" I don't know, replied Barney. Let's just go on a little bit more and maybe we'll see. There was a line of beech trees at the top of a little valley, and Barney felt there must be something on the other side of them. He scrambled up the slope, went between the dark trunks, and beyond them was nothing. It was like flying. Smooth turf sloped down steeply under his feet, and far below the land was spread out like a map. Lou, he called, look where we are. They realised they were standing on the edge of the North Downs, a place they knew well enough, and the moon made everything as clear as day. And yet, the more they looked, the stranger it was. There should have been pylons striding over the land, carrying electric cables. There should have been squares of orchards, hop gardens, villages and churches. There should have been cement works in the distance by the river, and where was the tall television mast with the red light on top? They could see nothing but forest and heath over the whole floor of a valley. And out of the night, strange animal noises came up to them. And in all this stretch of empty land, there were only three points of light twinkling to show that man was somewhere about. The nearest light was only a little way along the side of the hills, and now they could hear human voices coming from it. It's a campfire, said Barney. Come on, let's go and see. But it might be savages or something, said Lou doubtfully. There aren't any savages in England. There aren't any stags in this part of England, but we just saw one and this doesn't seem to be like England at all. Well, it must be somewhere, said Barney. Let's go and ask those people. Oh, I think we ought to be careful, said Lou. Let's creep up through the woods and have a look first. They went back into the shadow of the beech woods and made their way as quietly as they could over last year's crackling leaves and husks. Keep to heel, Dinah, whispered Lou. Barney, I wish we had a lead. Dinah might give us away. I've got some string in my pocket, I think, said Barney, and he rummaged in his pockets and found a coil of hairy string he had taken from a runner beam that seemed to have finished with it. They tied it to Dinah's collar and went cautiously on. Soon the sounds of the camp were quite near, and they could see the red firelight flickering through the black beech trunks. Sounds as if they're having a party, said Lou. Listen, music. That's not music, said Barney. Well, it's jazz or something, one of those skiffle groups. As they moved towards the firelight, keeping to the shadows, the noises were so loud that they didn't have to worry about keeping quiet themselves. They reached the last beech tree of the wood, a giant with thick roots coiling into the chalky soil and broad boughs spreading out towards the slope on which the camp stood. What are you doing, Barney? Hissed Lou, as Barney started scrambling onto one of the spreading branches. I'm going to climb this tree so I can see. So am I then. What about Dinah? You can't bring her up. I'll tie her up here, said Lou. Lie down, Dinah. Be good. There's a good dog. They climbed from limb to limb of the great beech tree until they got to a thick bough that grew out straight towards the firelight. Barney sat astride it and inched himself along until he reached a fork, far out over the bushes and brambles that straggled along the edge of the wood. They had a perfect view of the camp. Or was it a camp? There were beehive huts made of poles planted in the ground, tied together at the top and thatched with straw and rushes. In an open space there was quite a crowd of people gathering around the fire. None of them seemed to be wearing much more than Lou and Barney. All of them seemed to have a lot of wild black hair, except for a few grey and white heads. The older ones were sitting, lying or squatting around. Toddlers were tumbling and sleeping in the dust. Boys and girls were chasing each other round the outside of the crowd or teasing fierce-looking dogs. The noise that was something like music came mostly from a group in the middle of the crowd near the fire. There were 4 figures in the group. One was holding half the jawbone of a large animal, or running another longer bone up and down the teeth, making a scratchy rhythm. Another had a hollow log, which he was hitting with 2 wooden clubs. The third was the singer. He didn't seem to have much idea of a tune, and the children couldn't understand the words, but it was quite clear what the song was about. One moment the singer was a deer, grazing peacefully, and then, looking anxiously about, then he was a hunter, stalking his prey with the spear poised. Then he was the deer fleeing, the hunter throwing his spear, the deer falling, the hunter carrying it back to the camp. The crowd became as excited as the singer and joined in with hand claps and cries. But there was yet another sound which the listeners could not quite understand, a kind of bloom, blung, blong, bloom, not always on one note, as most of the singing was, and not really taking much notice of the rhythm of the log drum and the jawbone. It was as if someone who had never heard a tune was trying to play one for the first time with a tea chest, string or broomstick. Then the bones scraper, in his excitement, joined the singer in a little shuffle dance, and the children could see the 4th member of the band. On the ground was a large hollow animal's skull with great curving horns. Tied between the horns were 3 or 4 lengths of string or gut, and a small dark figure was squatting by this simple harp, plucking at the strings, blung, blung, bloom, blung, and taking very little notice of anyone else. In fact, the song came to an end. The drummer gave a final thump on his log, the bone scraper rattled to a stop, but the little harpist went on with his 3 notes as if he were the only musician in the world. Some of the crowd began to laugh and jeer at him as he played away, but it wasn't until someone threw a meat bone, catching him on the head with a clunk the children could hear in their tree, that the player looked up as if surprised to see that he was not alone. Barney nearly fell off his branch. "It's Stig!" he almost shouted. "Hush, Barney," Lou hissed. "You'll give us all away." "But it's Stig," said Barney excitedly. "I said he was clever. He probably invented that thing he was playing music on. Where's he going now?" For the little figure Barney said was Stig was rather sulkily walking away from the campfire towards the trees. "He's coming this way," whispered Lou. "Barney, you're not to give us away." "Why not? He's my friend." "What about all the others? Who are they? You never said about them." "I don't know who they are. I never saw them before." "Well, we'd better be careful, Barney." "All right." But what gave them away was Dinah, tied up at the bottom of the tree. She had been quiet up to now, but when she heard Stig walking towards the wood, she began to growl, and then to give short, sharp barks. On the edge of the bushes, Stig at once froze into stillness. Dinah went on barking, and some of the wild children playing on the outside of the crowd heard her too. The bolder ones ran to the edge of the wood. The little ones ran to their parents by the fire. Soon a number of alarmed elders snatched up spears and clubs and were making for the woods and the sound of Dinah's bark. Lou and Barney clung on to their high branch like squirrels, not daring to move. They could see the strange people on the edge of the wood, wandering around at the unusual sound of a spaniel's bark. Then, at last, plucking up courage to advance into the darkness of the bushes and the beech forest, holding their weapons at ready. Dinah's barking became more and more frantic as she heard the rustling of bodies through the bushes all around her and the crackling of snapping of footsteps. Under cover of noise, Barney whispered, "Lou, we've got to escape." "How can we?" breathed Lou. "Look where that bough goes." Barney pointed in the moonlight. The limb they were on stuck out into nothingness, but one of its branches went across to another long limb, and this one stretched out and rubbed shoulders with another great beech tree. If they climbed over into the other tree, Barney thought they could escape. "We can go across there," he whispered. "Come on, while they're making all this noise." Lou's face seemed to go pale. "Oh, Barney, we can't, and they'll find Dinah anyhow." "I'm going to try, and then perhaps we can rescue Dinah." He inched himself backwards along the limb they were sitting on until he reached the branch that grew crosswise. Then he came to it. He wondered what to do. It was too thin to sit astride, so he decided to hang underneath it like a sloth by his hands and legs. Upside down like this, he crawled through the empty air between the two big limbs. By bending his head right back, he had an upside-down view of the floor of the forest, patched with moonlight, and right beneath him was a wild hunter, the tip of his spear pointing upwards, but looking at the ground. Barney held without moving until the man had passed on, then moved as quickly and as quietly as he could to where the branch passed over the other great limb. Here he got himself right up onto the bough again. His heart was thumping and his legs felt quivery, but at least he was safer for a little while. But now he had to go outwards to where the two trees shook hands high in the air. He worked his way forward. As he went, the boughs became thinner and swayed more. At last he was where the trees met. Where the branches crossed, their movement in the wind had rubbed a great dry scar, and nothing he could do would stop a loud creak coming from this rubbing place every time he moved. "I must get over onto the other tree," he thought. As quickly as he dared, he turned round, so as to go backwards down the new branch, let go the branch he had just come up, and crack! It was a dead branch. Barney fell through nothing, then struck a flat leafy branch below, slid outwards from his on a lower one, crashed through, and fell through the last few feet onto the soft forest floor beneath him. See you next time.